I thought that help was here, but it was my own reassurance bouncing round 100,000 times in my own ecosphere. If every time you speak you keep it off the record, consequently you can keep your record clear. And if you mute the speech that shakes your frail beliefs, you only seek to insulate your image and continue down the stream in the direction clout and credit steers. Directly from your mouth into am I the asshole Reddit's ears. Directly back into the greasy pockets of some Gates Foundation financiers. And then directly back into the frantic final thoughts of early trial Neuralink volunteers, staring at the numb and mumbling vacancies where recently had been their peers. Half of whom are glitching with the memory stuck on pause, and half have zero fucking clue just who they are or why they're here. It's been said that fear is all we have to fear, but that was back before the Bezos fear condenser came along, distilling concentrated fear that's diamond pure, crystal clear, oppressor strong, and woven into every single article you read and song they let you hear. And then Elon heard that Jeff enhanced our fears by 86%, and he said, hold my beer. And not a single sheep among the herd would turn their head or say a word, cause they were all too busy begging for the shears, begging for the muzzle, happy just to guzzle, feed, and watch a screen for all their years. Man, to each his own, can't afford a home, but they'll let you have your cozy little ecosphere, where there among your own devices you can break the seventh seal, overthrow the oracles and slay the seer. All the tomes were burned and all the lips were seared. Shut your eyes and all our lives just disappear. Now blink 'em twice. Welcome to your ecosphere.
Legend says that Hercules swept Cerberus right off his feet and effortlessly set him down softly as a songbird. Atlas kept the world upon his back and every day wondered whether he could stand it any longer. And Tara Reade came out to say the man they tried to label the messiah of morality was really just another rapist. And I don't intend to hesitate when asked who was the stronger. Tara, like Assange, knew that carrying the truth would be the hardest labor. Tara knew that her assailant wasn't gonna make us any safer, and knew he's just the type of man to hand a decent foreign leader US printed walking papers, and knew he'd be relentless and aggressive in the war he'd wage upon her very character, that his attempts to weaken and degrade and embarrass her would be her only compensation. But I strongly doubt that anyone could ever have foreseen the stream of hate that came from quote-unquote progressives and the self-styled titans of survivor advocation. So if you really think there's something to be gained out of sharing your pain with the world, you are sorely mistaken. The Biden team just dragged their feet addressing Tara's allegations. Until they had a decent list of smears, then they aired them out on every station. And it turns out no one wants to hear the truth of who they praised as being worthy of such bloated liberal celebration. That no one wants to really know the person they've so valiantly defended, even when it meant they had to gloat and shit all over someone braver than they'd be if given the occasion. Now cue the faceless comment squad invasion. Cue those fuckers crawling out the woodwork to come analyze the way you wore your hair and what you wear. Like your appearance waives your rights, or that somehow you're the reason for your situation. Somehow they've decided you should bear responsibility for what such monstrous men insist on doing. Somehow they're deluded by the empty, hypocritical, and useless fucking platitudes that bastard keeps on spewing. And I think it's very telling that the best of their excuses when they try to come and justify our president's abuses is a hearty butt Trump. In which case I'll remind you that you never saw the news attempt to sell us Donald Trump like he was morally upstanding or a decent human. But when Joe says something bigoted or ogles someone's little kid, CNN says, isn't this refreshing? Biden's like a mix of JFK and FDR with all the finer parts of Harry Truman. Christ, I know that they don't think that we're the brightest, but at least pretend we got a couple lumens. Ask yourself if you have ever questioned what they fed you, or do you just shut your eyes and then consume it? And now ask yourself if you ate every one of Biden's lies under guise of harm reduction and the promise of a slight improvement. And now imagine long ago that Biden chose to show you who he really was by traumatizing you for his amusement. Now imagine that you watched him touch a Bible with those filthy hands, and then assume the power of the highest seat in all the land, of knowing your attacker wields a global coalition born of three-letter agencies who'll make a life's mission out of trying to discredit you through lies, damn lies, and collusion. Big tech is never gonna separate from our surveillance state. Fuck's sakes, they're just a breath away from total fusion. So there will come a time where even if you see the light, your voice will never reach the sky through all the bots and all the noise pollution. So trust us when we tell you that the masking of abuses is perhaps this country's oldest institution. And I know nothing nobler than facing it in honor of the truth when you know that the people holding power have been neutralizing truth since there was wet ink on the Constitution. So know that Tara's truth is something crucial to the movement. And if you see yourself a partner to the revolution, help this country see through all the baseless propaganda through the crux of Joe's illusions. And recognize that Tara Reade gave everything she had so she could tell us what the truth is. Recognize the decent thing to do when someone bares their soul and shows their bruises is not to ask for context or offer up your own solutions. Your job is just to listen with an honest mind and put yourself on Tara's side a moment so you understand the path she chooses. That there is no instant fame worth the dragging of your name. And if that's what you think, you've a lot to learn about the kind of facts the mob can handle and the kind that it refuses. You've a lot to learn about the news and all its many uses. Guess you've yet to learn the truth the news will serve as fruit from which they've squeezed out all the juices. And we all eat the husk and just pretend it's full of nutrients and isn't really useless. But the jaws of our ability to yield accountability are absolutely toothless. So don't you kid yourself that any lips are being loosened. They won't ever tell us where the bodies are or show us where the proof is. It's on you to recognize the lechery our president so regularly oozes. It's on you to muster up some honesty and ask yourself how Biden won your trust, but it's America that loses. Open up your eyes and learn to recognize the bruises. Open up your eyes and learn to recognize the bruises.
They'll gladly pay you by the hour for a minute or so, so you can sign off on the towers where they'll piss on your home. And if you feel like you're just powerless to answer them no, it's 'cause you are. They'll gladly pay you by the hour for a minute or so, so you can sign off on the towers where they'll piss on your home. And if you feel like you're just powerless to answer them no, it's 'cause you are.
gladly stagnate a living wage, snap the chains, bury it. Labor slaves in rusty cages dragged behind a chariot, led by Mr. Racial Jungle, Joseph or Iscariot, fighting over scraps as they barrage us all with variants and BuzzFeed clickbait, straight until we're paralyzed, trying to distract us from the concentration camps that Joe had swore he'd close but only chose to amplify, where they got 50-something kids in cages made for 5 to occupy. And no, she hasn't seen the camps, but Harris swears they're paradise. She tells us the facilities are safe, and that right down to the women, they are regularly sterilized. Then she throws her head back and she proceeds to laugh, that sort of heartless cackle you'd expect from someone working steadfastly on behalf of the virus and a Congress full of parasites. And where was I? I was busy cashing every blue check, demonstrating plainly all the infected from the verified. I was busy breeding verbal leeches by the terabyte. Train them to exsanguinate the wealthy while they sleep at night. Bleed the oil barons dry and barren. Say they showed us how to share and now we share alike. Tell them I contracted rabies from a feral mic. Now I'm just another species losing sleep to noise pollution and these glaring lights. Forced to change its habits and adapt to just survive. But now it's safe to say that some of us are thriving in the moment, throwing shit on presidential homes beneath the Paris skies. So if you feel like you're just powerless, I guess you bought the lie. But I can tell they're petrified of our collective might, 'cause I can hear those gentrifiers weeping at the sight of our collective rights. And I only can imagine the intensifying fear of knowing revolution's near, and all that's left to do is simply wallow in the thick anticipation of a rabid bite. And baby, one day you can ask your leaders just what that was like before you grab a slice. So if you think you're powerless, allow me now to change your mind. Honey, if you think you're powerless, allow me now to change your mind. See, they'll pay you hourly, tax them each apart, and build a shining tower out of loopholes and cards, and tell you that you're powerless to keep you in the dark, because you aren't, because we aren't. You see, they'll pay you hourly, tax them each apart, and make you build a shining tower out of loopholes and cards, where they'll tell you that you're powerless to keep you in the dark, because you aren't, because we aren't. Perfect time for you to burn the bridge to self-forgiveness. Now's the chance, take a stand, stay your hand before you cast another vote for corporate interest. Another vote that chokes your hopes of owning your own home or opening a business. They love to say their hands were tied, the stars just weren't aligned for them to get their votes in line to see their promises delivered. But they killed it in an instant. Bills don't die by accident, they're all assassinated on behalf of the congressionally kismet. By some lobbyists who see themselves as agents of clandestine fate, not fences in a prison. Dealing in the stolen goods of sleeping slaves and trading on the futures of their children. Betting on a spread of daily dead where every grave's creating profit by the millions. For some fascists lurking in the wings and all of their affiliates. And every Etna demigod our senators conduct their darkest dealings with. It really gets impossible to document or fingerprint, 'cause it isn't just a pattern of corruption, it's the very fabric making up the structure of the system that we're living in. So dash your hopes and down a margarita goes. You box the shadows, take a little nap, and then you get back in and swing again. But if the margarita made you sick, you probably wouldn't take a drink again. So if you're voting either party, honey, think again. I recommend you steel your nerves and never serve an officer, a president, a despot, or a king again. And mark my words, the day will come where we will rise and sing again. And if voting makes you sick, well, no one's forcing you to drink again.
I didn't have to wait for long. I never had to change a song. I just sing it like a raised alarm. Smile when you say I'm wrong. I can't even feign disarm. Can't fake while you play the charms. And I don't know the page we're on, but this is where you say you're wrong.
This is where you finally admit you weren't ignorant. You boldly voted Joe like an informed and blissful idiot. You chose to blur the parts of Biden you don't find the prettiest. Now you choose uplifting news and filter out the grittiest. But the truth is something coarse enough that even when it's hidden, it's apparent when you feel it on your fingertips. I know it's hard to deal with from a distance, and up close the truth is hideous. But there's just no getting rid of it. You've gotta let it in, or it just worries at your skin in every moment, loud or intimate. But shake it off, for fuck's sakes. You don't have to celebrate or be so proud of progress by imaginary increments. You don't have to heap such constant praise on fucking villains, like they're stillborn promises or honestly just isolated incidents, and not the product of the principle of privilege. Not intentional eugenics just by any other synonym, covered up with desperate clusterfucks of rosy images, labeled plain by any other name except for what the fucking image is. So once you stare the page down enough, you'll spot the difference. That one is red and one is blue, and that's the only truth, because neither one delivers on that promise of deliverance. One is red and one is blue, and that's the only difference. And the rest are isolated and imaginary incidents. One is red, one is blue, and that's the only difference.
I didn't have to wait for long. I never had to change a song. I just sing it like a raised alarm. Smile when you say I'm wrong. I can't even feign disarm. Can't fake while you play the charms. And I don't know the page we're on, but this is where you say you're wrong.
Wait, so if you don't trust the CIA or you don't trust like our institutions, then what do you trust? Wait, so if you don't trust the CIA or you don't trust like our institutions, then what do you trust?
The last track, I think I only blinked once. I skipped lunch. Blinked twice. Christ, shut your eyes. Now open wide. Fascists took the nation and inflation took a supersize. It's sad to say your teachers couldn't quite make the ends collide. But now you'll probably get to see them on the weekends doing Uber drives. Say lube it with a little oil. One, it tastes expensive too. You'd be surprised how well it helps you open up your throat so you consume the lie of human rights that was sold to you by suits and ties, designer scents on plastic men with patient fangs and ancient vice.
You know, the kind of greed that makes a person lose the sight of morals. So it's easier to sleep at night. It's easier to ease their minds and pick a foreign people we could demonize. If you take a sec to sink into how war criminals think, you'll know you'd never want to see inside. If every man's an open book to look within, theirs are bound in human skin and not designed for human eyes. They are wearing human skin, but they can simply not be humanized. They aren't worth the lowest of the poor they swore to crucify. Holy sweet Geneva, there's a mass grave full of dead believers you called the police on cause you don't believe in squatters' rights. You believe the sanctity of human life is relative to human worth in terms of work and dollar signs. So listen when I say you need to find the light of day before it's too late to apologize. Like holy sweet Geneva, here's a mass grave you can colonize. Because you seem to love to talk about the spirit of America. But if you saw the spirit of this land's supposed character, I think that you'd be calling ICE. And I also think the actual America is truly represented by the call to ICE. Is represented best by the descendants of some immigrants bitching about the immigrants, snitching on some immigrants, then playing dumb and innocent like good little Christians when their neighbors get deported. Until they're screaming at the store that they waited 20 minutes more because the staff was short. Because some ordinary bigot started waging war on immigrants. And honey, we'll just keep deporting because like your first vote and each election since, it turned out that the man you are supporting ended up to just be twice the fucking bigot as the bigot that he wins against.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome back to the Politics of Survival. I'm your host, Tara Reade. I'm really happy tonight to be with someone who I got to meet in Spaces. And Mario is this gentleman who's been doing Spaces with a bunch of people, and Him.com and some other people, and Pyotr Kurzin, who's on our show tonight. And you probably heard our spirited debate about Ukraine, but we also are quite like-minded in a lot of other subject matters. And I found his origin story and just things about him really fascinating. And I wanted to bring him on the show tonight to talk more about some of his views and also what he's doing and his Substack. So welcome, Pyotr Kurzin.
Hi, thanks so much for having me. It's
I'm sorry about my throat. I'm getting it back. But
no, it's okay. My name is rather odd. particularly with its accent.
It's a
So
beautiful name. It's very good. It's very
I'm
beautiful.
proud of it. It's just odd. People probably think, oh, that's not the right name for that accent or something like that. But maybe we'll explain that in the next few minutes or something like that.
So yeah, so Pyotr, when I met you on Spaces, you kind of told a little bit about yourself, and I really listened to what you had to say because you have a wide-ranging international knowledge and also experience. You went to Johns Hopkins University. You have traveled to so many countries. And you also have a really interesting story about your parents. I was wondering if you would share that with our audience tonight.
Yeah, so my background is a bit nuanced, in the sense that I was born in the UK, but my mother is, well, she's the most quintessentially British person, to be honest with you. If you think I sound plummy British, see her, she loves her tea, she has, I don't know, yeah, sort of thing. My father, on the other hand, is Russian, and very Russian. Comes from central southern Siberia, just outside the third largest city called Novosibirsk, specifically in a town which in Russian is known as Akademik Gorodok, or in English, which means academy town. And essentially, this was established in, I think, around the 1950s, to rival that of the Americans, of that of the West. It was essentially a STEM orientated city or settlement, to develop a specific, set of thinkings, practitioners, and so on, academics. And my father was among, he did his PhD in applied nuclear engineering and physics. Wow. And then did and had a minor in, I think, thermonuclear dynamics. My mother is a artist. She does heraldic art, which basically means the coats of arms, if you see on a shield of, say, a unicorn and a lion. So she does quite sort of, basically they're opposite ends of the educational spectrum, is how I like to sort of look at it.
As well, so I understand.
Yeah, all over the place. But yeah, so I mean, my parents' story is a little bit long-winded, so bear with me, but it is worth the while. So my mum's a free spirit, and in 1981 she was traveling around Moscow with her best friend Caroline, and they were, I'm probably going to do this shit now and they're going to have a go at me for this, but they were in Moscow. They're young women, they've just graduated university, and they're in the middle of the Soviet Union at the height of the Cold War. And what on earth are they doing? But they were fascinated by Eastern European culture. It was that enticement of the mystery or the unknown, and the desire to cross in the Iron Curtain and see for themselves instead of what was being presented to them. And, they were in the toilet, because how many world's crises haven't been resolved by women's, decision-making in girls' toilets, or at least on a night out or something. But, big, important decisions. I'm being slightly facetious, but they got community. Yeah, exactly. And the point being that they got in conversation with another lady, an elderly lady, and they were lost. They looked for the hostel, and they just arrived. And so she took them to a payphone and said, basically dialed a number, and this young man replied. And by Russian standards, he spoke reasonable, coherent English. He then basically turned up about half an hour later, because he was on his way back from work, and that was my father. Sergey. Sergey helped Jenny and Caroline, my mother Jenny, to go to their hostel. And then initially, Caroline and Sergey had a little bit of a spark, so I could not be here sitting to you if history had paved a different way. But in the end, Jenny and Sergey had a just a natural attraction. Sergey was, well, he had similar hair to mine. Maybe he's probably more handsome than me, but not that I'm that handsome. But like anyway, so he no, I'm kidding. But like he anyway, so they had a resonation, and then at the end of the 3-4 days that they were there, Sergey arrived to the train station with a single red rose in his hand, and he gave it to my mother through the carriage window of the train as they I think it was going back to Warsaw, or something like that. So it was basically a sign of we will meet again. And as far as I can remember, when I was young, my mother showed me the rose or petal or something, so she still has it in like a book, flattened. And then really... yeah, and then for about 9 years they stayed in contact, and this is where it gets really interesting, because obviously you're not allowed to communicate between Russia and Britain. So my father, and you can find this on the internet, he's done an interview about this, and so I'm going to paraphrase what he said, but he had a friend of a friend who knew a senior member of the diplomatic Iceland embassy. And so he would meet the representative of the Iceland embassy on Gorky Street. Gorky Street is one of the main streets around Red Square in Moscow, and they would meet under the cover of lamplight, and he'd get in the car, and they would just circle around. It's like literally espionage shit, because if someone saw a diplomatic licensed car with a Russian, particularly a nuclear scientist, getting in and out, converting information, that's like nuclear secret kind of risk stuff. So Sergei was literally putting his entire career and possibly more on the line, and he would deliver these letters. Then the letters would go via Iceland, Norway, because the Icelandic embassy was too small, and then down to the UK. And so this would take several months. Jenny would receive the letters or the communications correspondence and reply back. But this went on, could take months, weeks, whatever. So this went on for ages. In that time, my parents moved on, obviously, but they always stayed in touch. And then in 1990, at the end of the Soviet Union collapsed in 1990, Berlin Wall in 1989, Sergei, by this point, had become the head of his department. His thesis professor had become his subordinate, which is quite funny. He was only like 33, so he'd done very well by Russian standards, and he left that to come and visit my mother for, I think, about a month, and then he just didn't really ever go back. So he then made a new life. They somehow wangled him English residency and then a passport over time, and he had to start all over again, basically. But the bottom line is that if the Berlin Wall, Soviet Union, and all those sorts of things hadn't happened, then I wouldn't be here, which I think is what stimulates my interest in geopolitics, history, and such. So,
I would imagine.
So that was a long-winded rant.
He started all over again. Did he have to go into a different profession?
I mean, he was able to leverage his expertise to a certain extent, but initially he started off by by just going as a door-to-door salesman, basically, literally, for someone who is probably smarter or got a better degree. Not that accounts for everything, of course, but like going around and being treated.
That's amazing. Yeah. I mean,
but he had to deal with some tough things in the early 90s. My parents have said they wrote over like 500 letters. It's not like being, I'm whinging about applying to jobs in the 21st century. They had to hand physically write some of the letters. My mother at the time was working in what's known as the College of Arms in London, and she bought my father his first car, a 1960-something Lada. Russian Lada, of course. So there's my father driving around southern England in sort of 1992 in a, can I swear on the show? Fucking Lada. Sorry, no, bloody Lada. Lada,
for those of you that don't know, it's a very popular, pretty much main Russian car, but it's sort of like a Vega or like I don't know. What would you compare it to? It's not a posh car.
A piece of shit. A Lada is basically a shell. It's a very box-like car. It was made to be sort of the workman's car, and it became quickly sort of very cheap Soviet-style piece of thing that could be produced en masse.
Oh, funny she got a Lada. That's hilarious. In England.
Yeah, well, it was cheap, but also my mother was not as she wasn't in the position of sort of. She was somewhat self-sufficient, had family would support her, but she wanted to do it for herself. And she, at this point, had my sister, who was 6-7 years old when Sergei arrived. So he basically became her de facto father, because Emily's father had, there were some unfortunate issues concerning him. But so my mother was a single mother in the late 80s in London, sort of doing this sort of thing. Wow. That's why I have so much respect for.
That's amazing. She sounds amazing.
Women's rights and just, I don't know, women. Like, I don't know. I look to my mother very much as an important symbol of just respect for individuals who do difficult things, and particularly women who face things in, I don't know, not even the West, just in really difficult places. So so he was driving around parts of London, southeast England in a Lada, just trying to find his way, and then eventually he got into consulting in sort of natural resources and commodities. And because this is the 90s, Russia and the whole Soviet Union space was now basically a free-for-all, and because he had a lot of subject matter expertise, but also obviously knowledge, he could speak the language, he's a native, he began to well, I'll never forget it what my father said. He was asked by one of the senior people who was interviewing people to bring them on as a consultant. He said, you don't like he was like, your English isn't the best, but you clearly know more about this subject matter than the others do, i.e. his the other people they were looking at potentially hiring. And basically what Sergey was doing apparently was writing things in the margin, like sort of, well, no, I don't agree with this, in broken English or whatever, you know.
Oh, okay.
So he knew the technical matters concerning like the physics and the science of it, but his English wasn't the best. So he went to dinner one night with some person, and they were basically, what did he say? Who on earth are you? Like, what are you? What are you doing here? Tell me your story. A bit like you've asked me, perhaps more polite. And so Sergey just brain divulged all this random information, and eventually they took him on, and he became he went into natural commodities and stuff. So he took a big U-turn.
Very, very good. Well, it's really interesting. So, what part of England, near the sea? Is that where
Yeah,
you?
so yeah, Southeast England,
Yes.
Sussex.
Yeah, it's beautiful there, and I recognize your accent.
You can see a cat in the
So
back of your.
it's a strange thing, but I have this thing where I don't know why, but I can hear an English accent and spot the region.
Oh, okay. I just saw your
Yeah.
cat, by the way. Your cat was looking at your
Oh
crystal.
yeah, my cat wants to come up, and it's
Sorry,
wants to
I'm a big animal lover, so I'll deflect the conversation whenever I see an animal. I'm like, oh, let's talk about the animal.
Yeah, I love my kitties. I have a horse, as you know, too, named Charm that I like. Well, so the audience, for them to know, so they didn't know all of this about you, and it's really fascinating. And I know the part of England that you grew up in, which is just, if you haven't been there, you have to go there because it's beautiful by the sea. And a lot of it kind of reminds you of Jane Austen novels and things like that, really. But so the other thing that I noticed is you have a podcast called the Global Gambit. So can you tell our audience a little bit more about your podcast, and then how you connected into spaces? If
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean, so I think that my journey with geopolitics, international relations, current affairs, whatever you want to call it, is pretty I've been educated mainly in the West, but I've done my best to try and balance that by reading alternative sources and also living in other parts of the world. I've lived across Africa a few times and Eastern Europe and Russia, so not very long, but I've still tried to expose myself to different perspectives and cultures, because I think it's incredibly important to do that if you truly want to say you have a well-rounded. And I'm not saying that I even do. You can always learn more, which is why I entertain all forms of opinion, as long as it's expressed relatively reasonably and respectfully. When it comes to the podcast, I started that this year. It's just over 6 months old, and it's gone very well. I mean, I'm not going to lie, I'm a bit of a procrastinator, and I probably could have started this years ago and been much more, I don't know, established. I could have probably been ahead of the curve instead of always catching up on it. But the podcast was initially a passion project. Basically, I was very active on Clubhouse before Twitter Spaces. Clubhouse is the original social audio app, and I really liked the ease, but also influence that you can, well, not have, but you can experience the reach and impact you may be able to have of audio, because it's easier than this. I've had to make sure I don't look like a basket case for your show and listeners, but equally, we can convey so much interesting information via audio than we do just through written form. So I just liked the concept, and I became a little bit addicted with Clubhouse. And then we ran a room which was very, very large on the Afghan pullout last year. And I began to see the value and potential significance, if done well, of running spaces, holding conversations. And so I began to explore hosting more specific conversations with a guest or a group of people in like a panel, similar to what Mario has been doing in his own way. But on Clubhouse and in the political or whatever, topical theme, policy theme. And then Ukraine happened. And when Russia invaded on February 24th, that was a big day for many people. I cannot see my grandparents now because they cannot leave the country. I mean, they're over 90, but so the war in Ukraine.
They asked where they located. Are they
They're
still?
they're in academy town, so they're where Sergey grew up basically. I saw them about 4 years ago, probably, and both of them were, I guess you would say, state employees. I think they work for the government. My grandfather Vladimir was a statistician. Well, he still does work. I mean, he's 93 and he still does something to keep his mind going because he's like my father. He likes to keep himself busy. I mean, it's nice to indulge and do sod all, but no, they still do something. So anyway, when that happened, we opened a room. You call them rooms on Clubhouse. So we opened a space and we ran it for 24/7 hour, like nonstop, because spaces have a limitation on how long you can run them. We ran them indefinitely. We ran it just for 105 days straight. And we had, I mean, since then, Musk and Mao Mario have overtaken the record that I had made, which was 1.5 million people over those 105 days. So it was at the time the longest running and largest room on social audio. But
I didn't know that. That's amazing. That's very cool.
Then you get, the owner of Clubhouse of Twitter coming in, and obviously it's going to, blow up. But no, I mean, we didn't do it for that. We did it because the situation was really obviously dire, and not going into whether you line with one side or another, just purely for the global impact it had on everybody. Yes. We ran this room, and we were a bit like what Mario again has been doing. Is we were having media people in the room listening. We had all sorts of people. We actually helped to get about 600 people out of the country in the first few days when the Russian invasion was at its most intense. We managed to get about 500-600 people out of Ukraine into Romania via some buses. We managed to, because someone was listening in the audience, I said, I live in X and Y Z town near these people, because someone was coming up on stage, obviously in a confidential identity thing, but like speaking, saying, hey, we're on the border with you, Romania, we're in trouble. We feel, we were living in Kharkiv, and we've had to flee to the southwest where it's safer. So we actually did some tangible humanitarian, limited. I'm not saying we changed the world, but we did something, and we raised about.
We needed help. So yeah.
No, for sure. And I think we raised, I can't remember the figure, I think it was about 15,000 pounds or something. But we raised a lot of money and put that towards different humanitarian things. So the space was, But anyway, I mean, Clubhouse just, I'm not going to go into Clubhouse. It's been frustrating, and I could see the potential more with Twitter. So I shifted to Twitter. And since then, I've been hosting spaces, every other week. I'm not a big account. I've never used Twitter up until January of this year. I had sent 83 tweets and had 20 followers. Now I'd never used Twitter. I didn't. I don't know. As you can probably tell, I go on a bit and can't fit 150 characters of what I want to say. So, but then Spaces came along, and I was like, oh, well, I actually enjoy this, and I can convey what I want to say much easier.
I really like Spaces too. It's just a little glitchy. Hopefully they'll work that out. Like when I tried to run a Spaces, it would all of a sudden just shut down, or it wouldn't bring it just would get glitchy. I don't know if you experienced that. But.
Oh, it's terrible. Twitter Spaces is frankly very well, it's primitive. I mean, Clubhouse is an entire. So for people who are only used to Twitter Spaces, I'm comparing it to Clubhouse because I used that for more than about 8 months before I started really entertaining Twitter Spaces. And Clubhouse is all about social audio. It's all about, so everything is function, whilst Twitter Spaces is an add-on, and so it's very sparse of features. It's it's basic, and I think there's a lot more we could do with it. I think I mean, and what happened over the weekend with Musk's appearance in the other space, rendering the entire thing basically unusable for most of the communities, it's fixed now. But no, I like Twitter Spaces, and it's great
I do too. I mean, these discussions, because I kind of came across Mario's. I was trying to understand the FTX, and it just because you had the crypto Wall Street nerds throwing out all their terms. If you're a layperson to that, you don't know what they're saying. I was like, what does this mean? Because it definitely had a global international impact.
Oh, so you discovered at the same time as me through the
At the
FTX?
same time as you, and
Oh,
then I think what our audience is probably, that tuned in because they thought we were gonna, which we will get to later, Ukraine a little bit. They heard us sparring a bit, but you mostly sparred with Kim.
yeah.
I said my piece a couple of times, but kept it brief. You were a host, so you had more to say. But I wanted to ask you about Russophobia because your name and what your parents in England and the current situation. One of the things that I've been, because my platform is like a smallish platform, I don't know, medium, whatever, but I've been using it to try to push back on this. I really don't like the ugliness in America in particular of the Russophobia and the xenophobia and the bigotry and the racism. Actually, it's not just limited to Russia, it's other countries too, but it's really, I mean, there were things like in New York City where a composer, just because he had a Russian name, he was Russian, he lost his job, he was banned. The International Cat Show, they banned Russian cats. I mean, it got ridiculous.
Wait, what? What was that one?
This
Russian cats were banned? Wait, what?
International Cat Show banned Russian cats. I kid you not. So no one.
Have people not got anything better to do?
I know, and
That's
so
going to solve the war, isn't it? That's going to help.
a lot of athletes were banned from participating in their events.
Well, I
And
mean, the entirety. Sorry.
Russian American that lost their jobs, or they won't be able to get served in certain ways. I talked to one friend of mine who's Russian in Germany who talked about people not getting served in the hospital. They were turned away because they were Russian. I mean, it's I don't like it, and it's ugly. And so I've been pushing back hard on it because I don't understand how you can say you like one group of people and then despise another just simply because of their nation of origin. So I wanted to ask you if your family has experienced any of that and what your observations are, because you've been all over the world and you've seen all kinds of things. So what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, as with all of this, I can put on my personal head and also my professional one, in the sense I can use examples from both. But yeah, to your point, when Wimbledon decided that no Russian can play at all, I'm sorry, what? Yes, because clearly every single Russian player is part of the Kremlin and is clearly a Putinist mouthpiece. That is conflation. That is bullshit, and I don't agree with it. So no, I frankly deplore the arrogance of Wimbledon for treatment like that. I love tennis, but and luckily most normal people, i.e. non-people at Wimbledon, even the players, were like, what the hell is this? Like, seriously, guys? Like Federer, who's not exactly the most outspoken person, he's Swiss. Yes, I'm stereotyping. Is stereotypical humor, but it's Russian satire. It was like what, like, come on. So no, I think Russophobia is well, I think for a start, I think we need to be, not you specifically, but in this day and age, I do find that certain words are used very, very loosely when they don't necessarily have that application. Now, do I think that there has been cases of Russophobia? Yes. Do I think every single case where someone has been specifically treated a certain way or reacted because they are Russian? Not necessarily. There may be other factors to that. There may be their education. They may not be the best for a role. There may be some, I don't know, they may have had an internal tiffy with another part of the business they're applying to. There's a million and one things you may not know. And so therefore to immediately assume that it's Russophobia may not be true. However,
I was giving you examples of specific.
Yeah, no. As I say, I try to be as balanced in my responses. But no, I have personally felt that I have been limited in the options that I can have or make in, say, employment. I've purposely at times anglicized my name. So instead of Pyotr, I've changed it to Peter. And applied to the same position twice. I mean, obviously amending a few things on my CV, but trying to do a test to see if largely the two CVs are the same, but they have a different name, will that make a difference? And it has. It has made a difference. Starkly, no. Say again?
What difference did it make?
Well,
What
I actually got a reply from employers. So I would apply to the same position and I would use my Russian name and I wouldn't hear back. And I would, knowing that I'm more than well qualified for the position, and then I would apply with my English name or an English sounding name, whatever. And I would hear a rock back saying we're very keen to meet with you and so on. So it's a crude test, but it's certainly indicative of the fact that there is at least in America and probably Britain, well, yeah, Britain, definitely, the Anglosphere. In the Anglosphere, not so much continental Europe, there's definitely a Russo wariness. My father has actively had to remove his name from his company. I mean, he's founded many companies in natural mining and stuff, but he's actively had to step down as the executive chairman, at least I think this is right, on the Canadian, because they float the company on the Canadian Stock Exchange. He's actively had to step back from that leadership role because otherwise the company won't receive any, FDI or just interest at all, because of his Russian background. It's not so bad for me because I'm English and have a British passport. For Sergey, he's screwed, and well, no, I mean he's going to be okay. But the point is that yes, he's definitely had to reduce his public appearance of his in certain areas because of his Russian affiliation. Yeah, and that is just completely messed up. To blanket an entire nation as being, complicit in this war or any relationship with NATO, Ukraine, whatever it is just nuts. There are many Russians that are in favor of the war, or shall we say more aligned to the idea, but that's not necessarily because they're evil people. It's because they've been manipulated by Putin's propaganda for the past 20 years. So I don't think it's fair to label every Russian as being, sort of X, Y, and Z.
Let's go back to what you were saying. What really touched me was that your father, who has worked hard all his life, is now at an age where he should be able to enjoy sort of the fruits of his accomplishments and sit on a board, go to functions and be who he is. So I that's what I was like, yeah, I'm sure he'll be fine, but it's not fair, because it's, is of the national, because you're right. It shouldn't be, everyone shouldn't be lumped into the, can you imagine if Americans, we go overseas and then because of the Iraq war, right? Like, how come there isn't the same type of, I don't know, animosity towards Americans? Because you have Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan, Syria, Yemen. We could keep going on. And then
there's a lot of animosity.
But I mean, and Russia's not, and China particularly is not, but Russia's not as interventionist as the US, particularly in recent history. So it just seems odd to me. So let's go back
I mean, the Soviet, I think, again, when we start getting onto, one guy is bad, when we criticize one, that doesn't mean we're defending another. And I think we must be very clear on that. When I criticize Russia, it doesn't mean I'm defending the West. America's intervention in Iraq was illegal and completely one of the worst things for the entire destabilization of the Middle East. Equally so for Afghanistan. And look what happened. 20 years later, we're back with the same bloody group in power and the loss of all freedoms that the people should rightly have. The Soviet Union's invasion in Afghanistan in the 1980s was appalling. But then the Americans' deliberate creation of the Mujahideen to, make it hard of the Soviet Union. Everybody is pretty shit. We've all got skeletons in the closet. So when you're talking about the resentment or animosity that would be shown to Americans, no, I think that would be pretty clear amongst many populations, depending upon where you go. But at the same time, it's also because that advanced economy thing, those countries don't have that ability. They don't have that luxury to just say to Americans, no, we don't want any of your business, because America is a very wealthy country. And ultimately, the real politique, or the very, zero sum of it, is that the countries that have been plagued by American expansionism or intervention they'd still prefer to allow the foreign direct investment from America to come in, businesses to come in for the sake of ultimately improving the economics than they would by saying barring American businesses and people out of principle. Because at the end of the day, you're going to lose a huge array of potential money and therefore, income. I know it sounds pretty shit, but that's probably why I think you see some people just sort of sucking that up and saying, yes, we will, not because they like Americans, but because purely from a pragmatic purpose, it's economics, money talks. I don't know, and that's the hypocrisy of the West.
So where do you think the solution is, or how do you think this will shift? Because it feels really negative right now, just in the, like even when we were in the spaces, there's such high emotions about it. But I wanted to hear your perspective, because that's, when you talk to your father, when you talk to your family, and you're wanting to connect with your family that you can't connect with, it's more than just a geopolitical issue. It's an emotional issue. So how does this get resolved, and what do you see? Do you see us coming into peace in the spring, or do you see this kind of like Russia just forever being this enemy to the West, and this NATO expansion, and America just this, I don't know, Cold War playing out to almost a hot war, and so on and so forth?
Yeah, I think that so there's responsibility and guilt on both sides. I don't think that the Russians have helped themselves at times with the way that they have been a bit reckless in their foreign policy. What they're doing in Ukraine is not good. What they're doing in
What America did in Ukraine wasn't good. I mean, like in 2014 with the Maidan coup. I mean, that's historically, I mean, it's been proven that America intervened, that the emails and the phone calls were made public. Victoria Nuland was part of that, as was Michael McFaul, some of the others, and they wanted a different regime in Kiev, and they got it. Don't you think America shares some responsibility in going around trying to spread democracy? Because
as I said, I think there's responsibility and guilt on both sides. So,
yeah.
I think I made that clear. I think I'm not going to go into 2014. It's too nuanced for this conversation, but
Okay.
I think that one was the events that happened in 2013 and 14, and the other is a full-scale conflict. I mean, Russia does have a very particular way of conducting war. It's called total war, which means that they will not hold any prisoner. They will simply fling as many bodies at the issue as they need to win their goals. They will ransack and flatten anywhere that gets in their way. Scorched earth policy, it's known as the Soviet doctrine from the Second World War. And they did this with every country, every city. Think of Grozny in the Chechnya Wars in 1999. That was what they basically did in Mariupol. Now, again, not saying that the Americans are guilt-free but they don't conduct war, I think, in the same way. If people want to push back on me on that one, I'm open to examples where
like Libya. I mean,
no, I'm open to debate about that. But my point being is that the Americans and the West, to flip it and over to the other side now, certainly haven't helped the situation. I think that the continual expansion of NATO was one of the most unconsidered and quite sort of, well, it wasn't done tentatively enough. There was too much like, right, we're going to incorporate 6 or 8 states in 1999. We're going to incorporate another country. We're going to incorporate another country. Not to mention that this was also when the EU ascension was happening. We had the A8, which was much of the former Soviet states, and the A2, Romania and Bulgaria, in 2014. So simultaneously, you have a security group purposely created in 1949 to withhold and withstand the spread of communism, but also directly created against the Soviet Union, encroaching on more and more the borders of Russia. Russia's security concerns are a valid feeling for Russians to have. I'm not, and I think the West, particularly the United States and Britain, should do a better job of understanding that. It's too much of this. Well, the Russian, look at pop culture, much of the 1990s. How many films did you have with Harrison Ford playing some kind of role where, the Russians are the bad guys and he's coming to save the day, and the CIA as the president, as whatever, all the blockbuster films from the 90s, right? The Russians are scapegoats often.
There's
So
a lot of
I think
undertone propaganda, I guess, if you will. Yeah.
propaganda, narrative pushing, sure. Everybody does it. Some are just better at it. And
money to do it. Yeah.
say again.
Yeah, money to do it. So. Later, let's do that. Yeah, let's do that. Is that the Ukraine on fire?
Podcast today, or not today, a couple. Yeah, it's like 2 minutes. It's super short. Yeah.
New one. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
Is this the Ukraine War and Peace?
I think. I'm not. Maybe where he's pushing that. Probably. Okay. So yeah, it's 2 minutes.
Okay. A brand new documentary coming out from Igor Lepotonik, from who had worked with Oliver Stone. I don't know if you're familiar with his work. Oliver Stone's award winning. I'm sure you've heard of him, right?
Yeah.
Born on 4th of July, Snowden, all those films. Anyway, this director that produced some of those films with Oliver is named Igor Lepotonik. He's Ukrainian and Russian. And he grew up actually in Ukraine when it was former Soviet Union. But he did a documentary, which I haven't seen the whole thing. And I haven't really seen the last 2 minutes. But yeah, if you want to play
this is from Lex Friedman's podcast where he had Oliver Stone on recently talking about
from Lex Friedman's.
Yeah, okay. Talking about the buildup of forces near the Donbass and the Ukraine, a little bit of the coup, that kind of stuff.
I'm sorry. You know what? I will send you the trailer from Igor so you can see it. It hasn't been released yet, but let's look at this one. Go ahead and play Lex Friedman's. He's pretty cool. Yeah.
What the American press has not said, and the Western press has not said, is that on February 24, that was on that day when they invaded. The day before, if you check the logs of the European organization that was supervising, was in the field in Ukraine. These are neutral observers. They were seeing heavier and heavier artillery fire going into Donbass from the Ukrainian side. So they had apparently Ukraine had 110,000 troops on the border. They were about to invade Donbass. That was the plan. That's what I think. Russia, because of the buildup on the border of Donbass, brought 130,000 troops to the area near Donbass, right? So you have a buildup of forces on both sides, but you wouldn't know that from reading the press in the West. You'd believe that the Russians suddenly put all these men into the situation with the idea of invading Ukraine, not only Donbass, but invading all of Ukraine and getting rid of decapitating the government there, which is all assumption. We don't know what they would intend it to do.
But you, at the time, as did a lot of people, thought that all the talk of the Russian invasion of Ukraine is just propaganda. It's not going to happen. It's very unlikely to happen.
I think many of us thought that the United States is building this up into an invasion. In other words, that is the nature of false flag operations. When you create this propaganda, they are going to invade, and then when they invaded, the United States was completely ready, and all their allies were completely ready for the invasion. Correct. So why did Putin do that? He fell theoretically into this trap set by the United States. That here you're telling all your allies across the board they're going to invade.
Okay. What do you think of that? I don't know if you watched Lex Friedman. He's pretty interesting.
Yeah, I've spoken to Lex a few times. I think, one crucial word he said, I think. So again, it's just his perspective. It's not based on necessarily pure in-depth fact. So I think we, like the West or Western outlets and narratives, we need to take everything in bite size, with a degree of skepticism or awareness. the Russians were also doing their own version of false flag. There was false flag on both sides. I mean, there was evidence to suggest from analysis I've read that the Americans actually told the Chinese that they were thinking the Russians were going to do this in February or earlier this year. So what we ideally would like to see is the Chinese come out and say, well, is this true? Did the Americans say this? What were the Russians signaling to you? This is the point, but this is the problem between what happens between closed diplomacy, closed doors, backdoor diplomacy, and what we see given to us, not just through the media, but directly from the horse's mouth, i.e. the diplomatic and, states leadership themselves, because there's the amount of conversations that are being had in the UN on a daily basis about all sorts of things, and all we ever see is specific statements or paragraphs and provisions of information in a very curated sense. So do I think that the United States was trying to deliberately provocate this war? I can see where people have that sentiment, in the sense that, let's think about it. What would this mean? This would allow the United States to finally remove, or at least fully, significantly reduce one of their most historical adversaries from the international stage, and therefore reduce their capacity to be a security threat, reduce their capacity to interfere with American interests other parts of the world, and also allow America to come in and replace Russia, hypothetically, as one of the main sources of energy in Europe. The Americans have been very keen to sell shale gas to Europe, which is far more expensive than LNG. So yeah, I can see that. It's not a far-fetched theory, and no, the Western media outlets may not frame it like that. I've never denied that there's certainly a degree of manipulation that the West is doing. I mean, you can see it even in the way that the Ukrainians frame some of their arguments. At the end of the day, any war is about a narrative. The information war is as crucial as the kinetic one. And the Ukrainians have been much more effective at leveraging. I mean, Zelensky is an actor. He's got a lot of experience in PR, in presentation. Not saying that he runs all this personally, but the point is, they established the Ministry of Digital Transformation. They did a lot of specific things to try and shift the perception of Ukraine in some of the public light. And during the war, we've seen, Zelensky doing the rounds in front of, parliaments, delegates, all forms of important places to talk about what's happening in the country, what's happening with the war.
He wants money. He wants money. He wants money.
Well, he's asking for money. He's asking for general, isolation of Russia. He's asking for a general, prioritization of Ukraine. Whilst Russia,
combined now, it's how the money spent between NATO and the US is $80 billion. And there's more on the table. I mean, when you look at that amount of money, but there's not a lot of accounting, at least from the United States, there is no accounting, and there's a real pushback to try to get that accounting. And you and I were in the spaces during two real crucial conversations, which I thought were very interesting. The first one was during the missile. Remember, we were both there when that happened in real time. When the missile that was actually Ukrainian was called Russian, and because it was an old Soviet Union type of missile. But the point was, it escalated very quickly on media. Media just grabbed it and just went with it. And, we had a more nuanced conversation, I thought, on Spaces about it than the media was having. They were just immediately blaming Russia, and it was escalating the tones. And you had lawmakers come out and say there should be action taken against Russia before they even knew. So that kind of thing is so.
Yeah, it was just on that point. So Russian,
scary.
It was a Russian produced missile that the Ukrainians had as part of their air defense, stockpile.
Landed in Poland
and the missile fragments that landed in Poland were part of this air defense system.
Right.
Now, the Ukrainians were
We
quite.
came very close to a very big escalation. So where, I guess what I'm trying to get at is
No,
where
no,
does
not necessarily. No, I disagree with you. You know, the Russians have a more complex set of steps to undertake to prime and position nuclear missiles for launch than the Americans do. And when we say that we're on the imminency of nuclear warfare, we're never on the imminency of nuclear warfare, because the steps needed to actually reach that level are far more than any of us can even imagine. So, you know, when you say we're
just easy?
when
People
one
say
says,
just easy. When they hear the rhetoric, it's just that, it's rhetoric.
yeah, from be it from Fox News to CNN, I think they're as bad as each other, frankly. And I agree. CNN was quick on the bat of being like, "Oh, the Russians have done it," and I was like, "Well, no, guys, we don't actually know that information yet." And yeah, but what I thought was quite interesting was that Zelensky continued to press that it was a Russian missile. No, it did come from Russia. And it was like, well, no, it was your defense. But bottom line of all of this is that the Ukrainian missiles wouldn't have been launched had Russia not been launching military strikes into the country earlier that day anyway. So, I mean, we can point fingers at some, but ultimately, you know, it was Putin's decision to launch military strikes on Kiev in the morning, which didn't really help the matter. So I'm going to be fair there. I think Zelensky's continued pressure, maximized pressure of like, give us everything, isn't helping. And you're beginning to see that alienate certain countries and policymakers, which I don't frankly disagree with.
Countries are kind of pulling back. Like, are you
a little bit? Germans are on the fence. The French are a little bit. The Italians definitely. But you know, the British and, as I say, the Anglosphere, the Baltics, the British and the Americans, very argumently are on it. And I mean, the Baltic states I can understand because they're tiny and they are very much at risk from a opportunistic Russian, you know, expansion potentially. Putin has not made it very, very ambiguous that he has, you know, interests there. I mean, I think it's Latvia that has I think 25% of the population is Russian affiliated or has Russian orientation, like speaks Russian in very much in depthly, and has strong ties historically to the country. So, you know, and it's a population of only 2 million. So that's 400,000 people, more give or take. And again, and my ranges are not meant to be concrete, are, you know, aligned to Russia. So, you know, they're concerned by that. So I don't blame them. But it's this dogmatic hyper almost aggression of the British and the Americans, which I find the most problematic, and the one that puts my back up the most. To use one example, and then I'll land, is that Gavin Williamson, he was a guy in Britain. He was our defense secretary in 2018, and he is a complete idiot because he said at a conference of business individuals, when asked something about Russia, because Russia had undertaken it was called the Skripal poisoning in Salisbury in April, and they targeted a Russian defector, and 2 people had come into Britain claiming to want to see Salisbury Cathedral, which is a beautiful old massive cathedral, and they were interested in sort of viewing the architecture. It was like, guys, like, you look like you should be in a nightclub at sort of 2 a.m. Anyway, they barely spoke a word of English. And basically, so tensions were very high between Britain and Russia at the time. Anyway, and Gavinson was asked a question about Russian interference or just Russia X, Y, and Z. And he basically responded by saying, well, Russia should go away and shut up, quote. That's not a way to talk to anybody, let alone a nuclear capable state, which still has as much legitimacy to, well, existing, this was before Ukraine, as you do. So that kind of rhetoric is extremely, well, 1, stupid, 2, counterproductive, and 3, well, undermines your own ability to come across as some kind of morally superior country, as the British like to sort of do a lot. So it's this British American exceptionalism, which I encourage readers to go and look at if they're not familiar with the term. So
yeah, and I had another question about it because I'm kind of I'm struggling to understand it. So I was hoping you could help. Zelensky announced that he was putting forth, this is in motion, to ban the Orthodox Church in Ukraine. And the reason I'm confused about this is I thought that that was very much the heart of some Ukrainian culture as well. And that doesn't sound very diplomatic, by the way, because you know how America says we're spreading democracy or whatever, but that banning an entire church and then going after the priests. What is your thought on that? It's in motion. So the ban I think started yesterday or whatever. That's
Well, what I'm reading here is that he's considering burning churches affiliated with Russia. It's not just all of Orthodoxy.
no, that's what the Western media says. But if you look at international, like Al Jazeera or some other outlets, they say it's the Orthodox Church specifically to ban the religion, to ban the actual religion of practice.
Yeah, so I read Al Jazeera on a daily basis. Ukraine activities on Russian affiliated groups. So it's
what is your thought? What is your thought on that?
Well, one, it's not just Western media. I think we should keep that in mind. I also read South Chinese Morning Post, so I read Asian-oriented media as well. I also read
on the Orthodox Church about banning. Well, I mean, affiliations to Russian. I mean, whenever I talk to, like, for instance, I brought up Igor earlier in the interview. He's Ukrainian and Russian, and he grew, he did college or university in Russia, in Moscow, but grew up in Ukraine. But he said that almost everyone has ties to both countries: emotional, business, educational, and religious. So I'm just curious what your thoughts are about banning.
Well, no, I don't think. I mean, banning Russian affiliated religious entities is not going to change the stage or phase of the war. It's a pretty, it's a pretty undemocratic thing to do, perhaps. But equally, you have to understand that the Ukrainians feel, a large proportion of the Ukrainians, choosing my words very carefully there, not the majority, not the minority, a large proportion, are, very, very, absolutely, vehemently against anything and everything to do with Russia. The Orthodox,
okay.
Well, the Orthodoxy Church came about because when the Byzantine Empire, when the Constantinople, excuse me, can't think of my words today. I mean, Constantinople was basically taken over by the Ottoman Empire. It was moved and adopted by Muscovy. I can't remember the specific dates, but basically, you can look it up. Moscow became what was known as the Third Rome, because
go on. Yeah.
Sort of 14, 1500s, around that area. And basically, so Moscow, Orthodoxy has a much stronger affiliation with the Grand Duchess of Moscow than it does necessarily with the original Kievan Rus, which is where Kiev was founded in 1862 or 1882 by the Vikings that were traveling down to trade with Constantinople. So, the Orthodoxy Church was essentially, that's why you've got Russian Orthodoxy versus Greek and stuff, because it was purposely taken by the leader at the time and wanted to be protected, because Constantinople and Russia had at least the variations of what was Russia, Novgorod, and other entities that shifted around before Russia officially came around, was they were very strong alliance historically. So he wanted to protect the legacy and what remained of that part of Constantinople. And then you had the skirmishes with the Tatars. You had skirmishes with the Catholic Church over Poland. Sweden was around. And then that's before we get to the time of troubles in the early 1600s, for finally the current sort of, I forget the name of the Mikhail Romanov, who became the leader and led Russia for several, decades, centuries afterwards, that dynasty. So, Yeah, it's it's a very complex area, and I don't think that Zelensky's action here is necessarily going to improve the situation. It's certainly not going to improve the anti-Russian narrative that many people across the world feel is happening. But in the West, it's going to be, at least in certain parts of the West, it's going to be seen as an acceptable and proportionate thing to do. So, I think this war has really deepened those divisions between people who are in the West and think that the West is, more on the right side of history versus those who, well, everybody else, large proportions of the globe who think that it's, it's hypocritical, it's questionable of Zelensky's actions. So it's a very difficult. It's a very difficult thing, but I don't have. I'm not here to say whether or not it's the right thing.
That was a really good. That was a really good historical dive. Thank you. And I know the audience.
Yeah, sorry, I'm boring. I'm probably half your audience.
No. That's actually really fascinating, and I know some of the history, but I know some of the audience that doesn't. And so, you just sort of see something like that laid flat in a paper. It doesn't make any sense. But there's a long history with that church, with buildings that have been there for centuries, and families that have worshipped in a certain way. So it's kind of interesting. But I wanted to actually, also talk about something fun. The Twitter files.
Oh, I made it really serious.
Tell me what you think about the Twitter files.
I don't know much about them.
Yeah, do you think, okay, because people are saying it's a nothing burger or whatever, and whenever a bunch of media says, oh, it's nothing to see here, then I'm like, oh, there's something to see there. What is your thought?
Yeah, I mean, I don't really have an opinion on it, to be honest, yet.
Okay.
I think that I think that clearly there's been I feel mixed about Musk as an individual. I stand by the freedom of speech, absolutely. But, and I think I was initially skeptical of what he was going to do, what he planned to do, what he hoped to do with Twitter. But the rate at which he's fixed spaces, and the fact that he did answer my questions that I posed to him on Saturday relatively well, reasonably. No, I'm open to it, and I do think that Twitter has been run very much by a specific section of the political spectrum. I do think that it's based in California. California is a particular state with a particular set of ideals or narratives, and I find some of it suffocating. And oh no, very much, gosh. But AOC, anyone who self-proclaims themselves to be called the Squad, oh Jesus. Anyway, so no, I'm out. But so I do think there was this, the reports that they've been charging people what, $15,000 to be given a blue tick. Like what is that? So this sort of moral superiority that comes on sort of sometimes the progressive side, I think is unfounded. And I think that some of the information that the Twitter files may release about collusion or relationships or whatever it may be very interesting. But I have very little knowledge about Hunter Biden's frankly intricate relationship with certain people. I focus just on what is happening, and I don't get too much into, well, I mean, that's more domestic American politics from that sort of perspective. So
I understand that. And, really it leads us back to this big question that I have an opinion on, and you can probably guess what it is, but I really believe that there is something that a certain leader said that's very true, that we are in a multipolar world, and that the US and Britain is trying to force a unipolar world. And I don't mean that as existentially, as it's more economically. But I think if there wasn't this war, if there wasn't this amount of money, $80 billion, for instance, going towards weaponry, we could be using it for innovation and for well-being, for distribution of wealth in better ways, instead of feeding an military industrial prop. That's my position. Because like Raytheon, I used to work for Panetta when I was an intern. He's now
Leon Panetta.
Yes, and he's now sitting on the board of Raytheon. right? And Raytheon's one of the biggest weapons manufacturers. Their profits have tripled in 2 months after the war. America, and so that article that came out from the EU really kind of pissed off, saying the only one that's profiting from this war is the US. They're absolutely right. England's suffering for sure. Great Britain, I should say.
Well, yeah.
And Germany really, and France and Italy. Italy's starting to really feel it, and Greece, of course, and they're always kind of at the bottom. And then, of course, you know, the working people of Ukraine, the working people of Russia, the working people of Europe, you know, so the working class basically are taking the brunt. While you have a bunch of weapons manufacturers and diplomats or people that are, you know, getting enriched and empowered. So that's my objection. I think we should move towards the multipolar world. Now, I agree with some of your thoughts on China. I've read your Substack, which, by the way, I'd encourage my audience. Reef, could you put his Substack up? You have a really good Substack.
Well, it's been open less than a week, so
no, it's really good. It's really good.
Don't get too carried away, guys.
You've done a good job, and you have a good sense of humor, and people need that. I like that you injected it in one of your articles, and we didn't even get to it. So answer the unipolar question, and then I wanted to end with us talking about eco stuff, because you really, that's your passion, and you've done a lot of really good work on that. So talk to me about the unipolar versus multipolar. Well, I mean, it's okay if you don't agree, it's fine.
Well, no, but Tara, you've got to understand that a lot of this is theoretical. It's conceptual. The idea of unipolarity and multipolarity is all just stuff that we've made up to try and make sense of what goes on around us in the world. None of it happens in a linear fashion. There's not a rule book.
The BRICS isn't linear. Is a manifestation of the multipolar world. Don't you think?
Not necessarily, no, because again, it's interesting that you immediately mentioned BRICS. I haven't even brought it up yet. Look. Multipolarity is this idea that there can be more than one center point or two of power. In the Cold War, we had two central points of power: the Soviet Union, representing communism, and the United States, NATO, West, whatever, on the other side of capitalism. And then everybody else, which was called the Third World, which is now not really the right way to say it, or non-aligned, being, you know, think of George Orwell's 1984, where you have the three main entities. You've got, I think it's Oceania, Eurasia, or Eurasiana, and then something else, I forget. But anyway, the point being is that was quite a stable system in that you had them counterbalancing against one another. If you think about multipolarity more historically, so before, say, the 1800s, you had how many more wars? How often would wars break out between empires or just countries that are looking to expand their territory? Think the the 100-Year War, the Napoleonic Wars, whatever it is, right? War was so much more frequent. So you could say that there was multipolarity when we had the slave trade. We had the British, the Spanish, the Portuguese, the Dutch, the French empires all vying for influence in the New World. But it was also an incredibly unstable part of history because they're constantly fighting one another. So the idea that multipolarity is inherently better suddenly doesn't necessarily mean that. Now, we're in different times modernly because we've got nuclear weapons and we're much more integrated, etc. So yes, unipolar, or what's known as primacy, is the desire of the United States, because it likes being in charge. It likes being the creator of the current financial, economic, whatever you want to call it, system. So yeah, there is absolutely no denying that there's a vested interest amongst those who are at the top to stay at the top in terms of decision making. That's I mean, you'd be an idiot if you tried to deny that. What I disagree with when it comes to the multipolarity is not the fact that it's happening. I think we're already in it. I think we're in the transitional phase where the United States is still the most powerful power comprehensively, because power is measured by more than one way: military, economic, political, cultural, social, historical, whatever. Yeah, so nuclear. But you know, China is definitely here now. Russia isn't going anywhere. The West can try and make it, a vassal state, or what we call a pariah state. So it's on the periphery. It doesn't have any involvement. That's never going to happen. Russia's a massive country with still a pretty large population. It's got the largest natural, reserves of so many raw materials in the world. You're not just going to isolate that, because even if the West doesn't do business with Russia, everybody else will, and they'll be much more wealthier because of that. So, and the West even knows this, because even today, the G7, which is mainly a Western organization, are trying to, sorry, not the G7, the EU, are trying to impose a partial embargo, but only on seaborne imports of Russian energy, only seaborne, because they know that, because they want Russian energy. So it's interesting. Even the Europeans who are like, no, we're not going to rely ourselves on Russian energy or anything. Actually, they're not, because if they wanted, they could impose a full embargo. They could do a Cuba, right? That the Americans have done on Cuba, but they won't, because they know that Russia is too important and relevant that they can't do it. So, the subtleties are there. But anyway, main to the point of multipolarity, do I think it is here? Somewhat. India is definitely going to be an actor. It's going to overtake China as the wealthiest country next year, and they're going to be a very important player. Indonesia is a major power that we have to consider. Brazil is back on the stage. Mexico isn't exactly a small country to forget about. Nigeria, one of the largest countries by population in the world. All very important countries that we shouldn't ignore. But what I disagree with is the rate at which that multipolarity is coming about. Others have said that it's going to happen now, or it's going to happen immediately, and the West is going to disappear. Not necessarily immediately. China, if China didn't see the value, or didn't see the just pragmatic need for its own survival of America, it would have supported Russia in more than simply words. If we look back at this conflict over this year, what has China done other than offer strongly worded statements and messages of support to Russia? Not much. There's no material support. There's no financial. There's definitely no military, at least that I can tell. And that is because China knows, from a long-term strategical thinking, they would be worse off not doing any economic business with or trade with the West and focusing on Russia. Russian trade with China is about 2% for China. For Russia, it's about 16%. China trade with the West, which also I think we need to keep in mind, is about 40 different countries around the world. So there's lots of different variations in how countries in the West think about Russia, Ukraine, China, and lots of different things. France's position is very different to the British, for example. China knows it will be ultimately worse off if it doesn't continue to engage with the West in some way. Is it thinking of trying to decouple and go it alone and find an alternative financial system? Yeah, sure. I can see that. The BRICS, yeah, sure. But it's not going to happen yet, because they're just not in a position to do that. So when I disagree with people, it's not because I don't think what they're saying has any sense at all. No, of course it does. And frankly, I agree with them to a certain extent. I want more competition, because it would mean the Europeans, the Americans aren't so complacent and actually have to, take their finger out of their arse, to quote my father, and be a little bit more delicate with how they play the diplomatic games. So I hope that makes where I'm coming from, because it's not just about the issue in crudeness. It's about timescale. It's about what area you're talking about. Geopolitics is anything but black and white, and anyone who
it was kind of picking up from where we left off in spaces. You got kind of cut off when you were talking about BRICS, so I'm glad you kind of expanded that explanation a bit.
I like the idea of BRICS. I just don't think we should be overly confident or overextending yet the potential that it has. There are other organizations that are run and established by China that I think would be actually more influential than BRICS. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization is one of them. The SCO, it's a economic bloc. It is a small military cooperative group. It's also a cultural exchange. So for listeners or people who are interested in this, don't just focus on the BRICS. The BRICS is the one that's been promoted the most, but there's lots of other alternatives. The Chinese created an Asian Development Bank in 2015, I think, to rival that of the World Bank. And it's going quite well. The British joined it, and the Americans were really pissed off that the British joined it in 2017, I think it was. They're like, no, you mustn't do this. And they threatened the British. I can't remember exactly what it was, but like, so America, no, you know, so no. When I say these things, it's not because I'm sort of completely indoctrinated by Western propaganda or media. It's just I think we need to be a little bit more considerate of timescale and you know. So anyway, sorry, you asked me a question, then I go off.
No, actually, that was really good. I like well-rounded answers, and that's what you sometimes with spaces you don't get that, and that's why I wanted you on the podcast. But with the I noticed on your profile you had World Bank on there. Why? What affiliation did you or have, or why was that on there?
I'm a consultant at the World Bank. That's what it is. I mean, what I find entertaining about people who you know, ridicule me, and you know, I read through every message, I read through every comment.
I am not taking that position.
No, I'm not insinuating you are. I'm just, you know, for people who think, I'm very well aware of the certain opinions people have of me. But what I would say is that I think it's important to look beyond just the labeling. We have a terrible habit in humanity, both on the far right and the far left, and anybody in between, to be honest with you, of labeling people immediately. You know, people have probably labeled me tonight because I have a certain accent or because I look a certain way. And I do it sometimes. No, but you know what I mean. It's inherently natural. You know, it's inherently natural, and I get it. But at the same time, I think we need to be balanced. The World Bank is, you know, part of the United Nations. It isn't the UN. It's different. It has a different power structure. There's a president of the World Bank, and the UN Secretary General, who doesn't respond to him. So anyway, so these are different. But the World Bank is seen as this, you know, component of the establishment, the World Economic Forum, and all these things, and the desire to want to, you know, retain that sort of influence. And for sure it is. But clearly the Chinese see something in it, because they've been over the years trying to infiltrate and influence it. So it isn't just an American-dominated system. It's every country is jostling for influence in these organizations. So when I work for the World Bank, I'm not its spokesman. I'm not its, you know, there's 17,500 people who work there of all nationalities. I think the largest nationality is Indian, or maybe American, because it's American. But the point, you have consultants all over the world. I work there, you know, in different projects. Projects can be as short as 28 days. And even when you have a job, you have to be searching for another one. So it sounds really nice. It isn't. Half the time, unless you've got a fixed staff position and stuff like that. But as you're a consultant, it's a massive headache. So, and half the time I'm not even working on stuff like, I'm working on climate change. I'm working on issues pertaining to developing countries, the global south, and not necessarily from a Western angle. Most of the team that I've been working on more recently have been all from, I think 2 of them are Indian. One of them is from Brazil, and another one is from Uganda, I think, in Africa. So it's very diverse. And the other bottom line reason I take it, yes, you could say that Orama, it is another arm of the US hegemon. Yes, possibly. It's an instrument used to try and, you know, promote Western ideals, for sure. So I'm reading the comments that come through. But I would say that...
comments. Okay.
Oh, but it's coming on your politics on the indie news.
Oh, okay. Yeah, you'll have to read them. I can't see them, so go ahead.
The last thing I would just say is... yeah, I think your colleagues just put it back up. But but the bottom line also is, because when you go into the industry of diplomacy or international relations, the World Bank is a good place to work, at least for its name. And so, like anybody, I'm just trying to, you know, make my way independently as well. It's also really a careerist decision. You know, it's not because I have some ulterior motive and bloody agenda. So my computer's about to run out of battery, so let me just grab my my recording cable. Sorry, and then I'll be back in 1 second. Sorry about that. One second.
You got your power cable going there? Okay.
Oh.
What do we have going, Reef, with questions?
Not much, other than like what we've already said, mainly.
Okay.
I mean, unless you want to get into like, yeah, that works.
No, I wanted to ask him about the Brazil. We got Lula. So that was really, because his article is really good on the eco stuff.
Happy to talk about whatever.
I can answer some questions. I wanted to talk to you about your Substack had brought up Lula and Brazil, and it's kind of exciting to have him as president, obviously, for a lot of people, because he'll be more conscious of eco, and you think about the Brazilian rainforest and just all the things that are going on. Could you talk a little bit about the article that I read? I think it was this morning, about
My article.
about the
Oh,
conference.
yeah, sure. So that is well, I mean, I wrote that over the weekend. Basically, what I'm going to start doing is writing weekly forecasting pieces, looking forward to the week ahead, and trying to provide not taking simply descriptive, not this is better because it's Western or so on, just purely an outline of what is coming up, and what could happen. So this week we have the UN Biodiversity Conference in Vienna, I think, or somewhere. And we also have the policies with the G7 and the EU that I mentioned, and also OPEC meeting in Vienna, and then also the China protests. Those are the three main areas. But in reference to your Brazil question, yeah, so we had a major election in Brazil, and Lula is a very he was in power from 2003 to 2010. And in the 2010s, he experienced a significant amount of issues over corruption allegations. It was known as the car wash scandal. I have a brief degree of knowledge of Latin America. It's not my main area of expertise. But Lula is seen by many as very far left, very progressive. And so he was going up against Bolsonaro being the nationalist, populist, who was part of the Brazilian military. And he, so opposite ends of the political spectrum. And in many ways, I would look at comments on, Reddit or postings on Brazilian websites about feelings, chat boards about how they felt. I find one of the best, actually, this is one of the best ways I like to, sorry, it's a small tangent, of a way to really see what people think, is go to message boards, forget the media, forget, YouTube from specific content creators, go to message boards or chat rooms where people are just talking. No, you don't know who they are and what their necessary background is, but you can begin to get a sense of how people from different areas of the country or issue feel about it. And it's a really interesting way to just hear from the people. It was before Spaces necessarily. Spaces is a nice nuance to that, but it's quite an interesting. And so I was on these message boards, and some people, really hate Lula, others really hate Bolsonaro. So it's a mixed bag. I'm not going to say Lula's the best thing ever. It'd be nice if the Brazilians had more choice, if I'm honest, of candidates. But he is an environmentalist, and the Brazilian rainforest, Amazon rainforest, is the largest carbon sink in the world. The second is in the Democratic Republic of Congo in Africa. And Bolsonaro has basically, ransacked the rainforest for years under his presidency. And so Lula wants to, restore preservation of it. I think it's about 500 square kilometers he wants to restore, or preserve rather. And he's also talked about, Brazil returning as a steward of global environmental leadership, which I think is important. And that being said, he has also admitted that he will still be supporting certain oil and gas industries. So it's not like he's suddenly going all green tree hugger and not supporting energy transition or other non-renewables. So I think I think it's going to be interesting to see what he does. Brazil at both COP26 in London or Glasgow last year and in Egypt, I think, were the largest delegations. So at these UN conferences, many representatives of the country appear to basically push their issues, push their topics, and try and get funding, try and get pledges, try and get, it's networking. It's all very cliquey. But on the whole, I think Brazil is, I remain cautiously hopeful. But that's all I can really say on it.
Good. Well, you've been really generous with your time. I just want to say thank you. And I know the audience appreciated it. And if people have questions and want to find you, what are you up to these days? What's going on?
Yeah, so thank you very much for your time. I know we spoke for a long time, and I probably went a bit technical or deep.
Absolutely. No, I that's exactly what we wanted. So that was perfect. So absolutely. Good job.
As I say for listeners, I may come across as a certain way or speak a certain way. I think it's best for you to judge for yourself by coming to, and this is what you asked me, to my spaces. I'm very active on Twitter. I host regular interviews or panels with people about everything that's geopolitical, current events, sort of things. I don't shy away from any issue. And, you know, I'm open to hosting people of various degrees of perspective, as long as they can convey their points in a reasonable and, as I said before, respectful manner. I want to sort of, you know, Lex Friedman is I'm glad you played him. I have a lot of respect for Lex and his interview style. And I think that we can do something similar in the specifically geopolitical realm. So bringing on people who have a particularly strong background and asking them and trying to understand their way of looking at things. So yeah, active on Twitter, sign up to the Substack if you want. I'm open to suggestions and feedback. You know, if people recommend me because they think I'm a little bit too one-sided on an issue, recommend me something to read, recommend me something to listen to, and I will I'll do my best to improve my holistic understanding, because I think it's, you live once and you shouldn't stay in a silo or in your bubble. So, but thank you very much for having me. It's been a very nice.
Oh yeah, it's been delightful, and I'm glad you've gone into depth with your answers. That's exactly what my audience expects and wants. So thank you very much. And again, you've been really generous with your time, and I appreciate that. And I'd like to have you back on again if you're willing. To
yeah, happily. I suggest, you know, maybe if people want to hear, you know, me discuss a specific issue that we've touched upon tonight, or a specific other thing, or they want me to go, you know, actually have a debate with you about something properly, like, you know, US, NATO and versus Russia and who's more responsible, or, you know, that sort of very, you know, obviously we can do that. I want to keep it narrow and specifics, because otherwise you can go off into the weeds and it can get very, very, you know, misconstrued or complicated. And I think for the sake of argument and clarity, it's good to be narrow and targeted.
Well, absolutely. And thank you for sharing your very personal story about your parents. I still think it should be a movie or a book or something.
Yeah.
It's really lovely, and say hello to them.
Well, they say they call it From Russia with Love, but unfortunately that was already taken. But I love James Bond. It was one of my favorite genres growing up. So anyway, thank you so much for your time, and to your colleagues for helping us put on the show.
Sure. And to everyone who's listening, please check us out. We're going to be coming up next week with another guest. It'll probably be a Thursday show, but I'm not sure. I'll let you all know. And thank you for tuning in tonight and putting up with my little bit of recovery from this cold. I'm losing my voice, so I'm going to say good night. See you next time. Take care.